So my talk is titled C.P. Cavafy and the Classical World of Tragedy, just because I think that's quite a useful way to sort of overview, kind of give an overview, an umbrella, if you like, to all the different things that I'm going to sort of discuss in this. I'll start with a picture. It's a wonderful picture of him when he is a younger man in this picture, but I've got lots of different pictures and drawings of him throughout the presentation. I think it's a good one to start with. So just a couple of notes before I do start. This should be about 40 to 45 minutes, and then that should leave about 15 minutes for questions or discussion at the end. Obviously, if you do have any questions during the talk, I don't want this to be super formal, so feel free to use the chat, and I will do my best to look and check for questions there, and I will respond to any of them if they're sort of relevant to what I'm talking about in the presentation. But obviously, if you would like to sort of save them for the end and ask them if anyone has any at the end, that's absolutely fine too. As I said, this will be being recorded just so I have a copy of it, but I won't record the discussion at the end. And obviously, if anyone has anything they need to tell me during that, that's absolutely fine too. There should be some information on the screen and some that I will go through just out loud. If there are any issues with that, do let me know. I'm happy to give people a copy of the PowerPoint at the end if anyone wants to sort of follow up. There is a list of sort of reading suggestions at the end and bits like that. So if anybody wants any of that, that's fine. You can let me know. I should also say here, there is a content note. There are some sexual references. There's nothing like, there's no sexually explicit images or anything, but there are some sort of sexual references throughout. And I just want to make people aware it's absolutely fine if you have to disappear. I won't be offended or anything. Just letting you know in advance. So now that's all sort of out the way. I want to start with a fantastic quote from E.M. Forster, who was a friend of Cavafy's for well over 20 years, and is sort of credited as being the man who brought Cavafy to the English literary canon. He wrote an essay about I think it was the Poetics of Cavafy or something along those lines. And in it, he kind of explored Cavafy's poetry as it stood at the time that he was writing. And it was a sort of quite interesting sort of essay, which kind of brought him to sort of public understanding in England. And this is the quote that he used to describe. This is one of the first sentences in the essay that he uses to describe Cavafy. He describes him as a Greek gentleman in a straw hat, standing absolutely motionless at a slight angle to the universe. And I love this quote for lots of reasons, partly because it is so beautifully poetic. It's a wonderful description of anybody, but also in terms of it being a description of Cavafy, I think it's wonderfully kind of expressive in very few words. There's sort of two things I want to pick up on here before I sort of move into the body of the biographical information that I'm going to cover. One is the slight angle. I love that description, the slight angle, because I think it captures so many of the ways in which Cavafy is just slightly outside of so many of the circles that he either once was in or would normally have been considered to be in. Obviously, some of that sort of slight shift, that slight sort of aberration from the norm, I think comes from sort of lots of aspects of the way that he looked at the world, lots of his experiences, as I will cover in a minute. But also it's a sort of fascinating way to explore the ways in which his poetry takes very conventional subjects and shifts them or uses them or creates a kind of new aspect or form out of them. So I think that part's interesting. And the other part that I love about this quote is the motionless. Because on the one hand, I think motionless is a fantastically accurate description of his poetry, and on the one hand, it feels completely ironic. Cavafy's poetry moves a lot. If anything, I think when you read a collection of his poems, you feel as though you're moving rapidly back and forwards within time and often within spaces, within emotions and lots of other kinds of things. I think motionlessness is a kind of ironic gesture in many ways, because I feel that his poetry moves often and somewhat eclectically. But at the same time, there is a sense of circularity and of stasis in some of his poems, which is kind of which are often preoccupied with time and the idea of sort of eternity and the divine, and so many of those other sort of static aspects of life, which is quite interesting. And I'll get into all of this later in the presentation. But I just like to start here because this is a wonderful quote, and for many people, this was the first description of Cavafy they were given, and I think it's nice to kind of mirror that in this presentation. So some biographical information is a good place to start. This talk is kind of in two halves, roughly, with some biographical information and description of Cavafy as a person at the beginning, and then moving into a kind of exploration of his work. Obviously not all of it, I couldn't cover anywhere near all of it in 40 minutes, but hopefully a sort of interesting selection to get you started, and then you can go from there if you want to find out more yourself. There's another wonderful picture of him, this time sporting a rather fabulous moustache. And I want to give a short recap biography of his life. So his full name is Constantine Peter Cavafy. Cavafy is a sort of anglicization of Cavathis with a K, which was the Greek family name. He was born in 1863. He died in 1933. Which is really interesting because, for reasons I will explore later, lots of his poetry is not revealed or published or seen until after he dies. And so many people think of him as a poet from the 1900s and associate many of the kind of things that he was thinking and writing about with the 1900s, when in reality a huge amount of his poetry was produced in the 1800s, late sort of 1880s and 1890s in particular. So I think it's interesting that that's an association he has gained as a result of the kind of release of his work rather than with when it was actually being written. So that's something to bear in mind. And I will look at poems throughout the whole canon in this, from the 1890s all the way through to sort of the 1900s and so. So yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect to consider. So he was born in Alexandria in Egypt, but to Greek parents. He had 8 siblings. They were a huge family. He writes in Greek and he visits Greece often, but he doesn't actually live there for very long. And he is born in Alexandria and lives in Alexandria for the vast majority of his life. And is so, I think it's quite important to consider that, because he writes much about the Greek classical world, but also more broadly about classical empires like the Byzantine and Syrian sort of civilizations, as well as those of Greece, some of Rome, and of course of sort of less ancient Egyptian civilizations as well. So that's sort of an interesting aspect of the geographical nature of his work. He's a son of an import-export merchant. His father was a very successful man. They had a lot of money. When he lived in Alexandria, they lived in quite a big fancy house. There are records that show they had servants and drivers and chauffeurs and those kinds of people. So they were a family of some not insignificant wealth, which was quite unusual. So yeah, that's an important part of his life. His father dies in 1870, and because of the unfortunate fact that his father was rather successful in making money, but not always very good at making good financial decisions, the family lost quite a lot of that money after he died. 2 of his brothers took over the family business, and they moved to Liverpool, where the import-export business has one of its biggest offices. They live in Liverpool for some time. The brothers do an absolutely terrible job of looking after the family business, and they lose a lot of money and are no longer able to afford to live in Liverpool. So his mother moves him and his siblings back to Alexandria. They live in Alexandria for a few years, and then in the early 1880s, his mother starts to be concerned about the British involvement in Alexandria, and the family moves to Constantinople in Turkey. In 1882, the British bombed Alexandria, and in the bombing of Alexandria, Cavafy's family home was destroyed, and along with it, much of his work. And so the family survived, but a lot is lost. And I think that forms part of his decision to then move back to Alexandria in 1885. He leaves the family home in Constantinople and returns to Alexandria, where he lives the rest of his life. He worked as various things. He started out as a journalist and newspaper correspondent. He was then an assistant on the Egyptian Stock Exchange for several years, supporting his brother, who had a business there. And he maintains a sort of dabbling interest in the stock exchange for the rest of his life. But he does the vast majority of career at the Egyptian Ministry of Public Works, where he works for 30 years, which is a not insignificant period of time. He started out there as a sort of doing sort of volunteer work, and then is given a salaried post a few years in, which is where he remains. I think it's interesting as well to draw attention to the fact that he's not a writer or poet for any professional or kind of career reasons or lengths of time. He doesn't that's not his job. He is a public servant and involved in many aspects of that, rather than just being a poet or writer by trade. 11 years after he retires from the ministry, he died of cancer of the larynx. He was a lifelong smoker, He died on his 70th birthday, which is a wonderful moment of sort of circularity again, which I think is interesting. It's also mimicry of Shakespeare, which is quite amusing. It is said that his final act upon his deathbed was to draw a circle and put a dot inside of it, which was the copywriter editor's symbol for a full stop, and a full stop needed adding to a piece of work, which is wonderfully poetic, I think. So that's a kind of overview of him and his life, and I think it will become obvious how some of these biographical details tie in to his work and his life as I go on. So obviously it needs addressing that the reason this is part of the LGBT student talks, LGBT plus student talks, is because Cavafy is gay. He first writes about queer experiences, which he has his first experiences in Constantinople, can't speak, while he was living with his mother, and his first sort of openly homosexual poetry appears in this time. I say open, it was not ever publicly published. Much of his work, as I will explore later in the presentation, is not released until after he dies, or is circulated privately among just sort of close friends. And so the idea of the poetry being sort of evidently homoerotic is something that we can sort of draw a timeline of now, but would not have been a part of his public perception at the time. So very little of his poetry is published during his lifetime, partly because, as I said, he's not a writer by trade, that's not what he does, but also because a large part of his poetry it talks of romantic encounters and sexual experiences with other men, which, whilst never explicitly illegal in either Egypt or Turkey, would have undoubtedly prevented him from doing the jobs that he wanted, and would have had other sort of social consequences. And so he's very much forced to keep that in terms of his writing and his kind of publishing, which is very minimal, very much sort of a closeted part of his experience, although he does share some of his erotic poetry with close friends who knew about that aspect of his life. And he also discusses in a lot of his homoerotic poetry that idea of the boundary between the public and the private, as I will sort of go on to show in some of the examples that I pick out. It's perhaps put best by Auden, who writes in a 1961 essay that Cavafy was a homosexual and his erotic poems make no attempt to conceal the fact. Now, I think no attempt to conceal is a really important, sort of a really significant piece of the grammar in this sentence, because it's not, as you will sort of see, I think, much of his poetry is not about specifically the celebration of the queer aspect of his experience of love and sex. Much of his expressions are more generally about sort of passion, love, and so on, and the ties that has to the classical world in his depictions and representations is a huge part of that. Because obviously in much of the classical world that he's writing about, they would not have had the same sort of hang-ups and social consequences and so on for homosexual and other sort of queer behaviours. So I think that's an important aspect of that to remember as well. So yeah, just to make sure that that's clear to people why this is being included in this set of talks. So I've talked a lot about him. I'm now going to sort of give a brief overview of his poetry and what it's like. So Mendelssohn, who writes the introductory essay to the new translation of his work, described it thusly: scholarly poems set in the ancient world and poems about sexual love set in a more or less recognizable present. He draws a dichotomy, essentially, between poems which he feels have a historical content and poems which are more about the sort of experience of sex and love. Now, I think this is quite a useful dichotomy when you're starting out, and certainly on first read, it feels as though this is the way that the poems are kind of divided, if that's possible to even do. However, whilst often dichotomized, often his work is looked at through this kind of split or lens. His work, of course, is truly a coherent whole, and that is reflected in the fact that he often called himself a poet historian when describing his writing work, or a poet novelist, despite the fact that he's not famous as a novelist, although he does write essays and other prose work. So he often described himself as a hybrid, and I think his work has that hybridity, that distinct hybridity to it. And I'm going to explore later in the presentation, when we get to looking specifically at some of the poems, how that sort of divide is kind of melded through his writing work. So one of the things that surprises a lot of readers, and certainly surprised me when I was learning about Cavafy, is that many of his early poems are very musical and form very strict verse, which is, as you will see in a moment when we look at some examples of his poems, quite shocking, I think, when you see poems, the more sort of iconic and famous poems of his later works, which are very much free verse, reliant on meter and rhythm to kind of maintain the poeticism, but almost prosaic in their presentation on the page. Whereas many of his early poems were sonnets and other sort of strict verse forms. And so that's an interesting sort of aspect. 40 appears to be a significant year in Cavafy's life. He turns 40 and suddenly has some quite sort of major existential concerns, but also it really seems to sort of show in the shift that he takes in sort of form and style in his poetic writing. So yeah, that's another interesting moment. Mendelssohn, again, in the introductory essay, describes Cavafy's language as shunning conventional poetic devices. So there is very little use of image, simile, metaphor, any kind of specialized diction, any kind of techniques, any kind of those conventional poetic leanings, which Mendelssohn means that Mendelssohn describes this as if Cavafy's poetry is tantamount to prose, and that prosaic quality is really significant, I think, in terms of the way that we access and explore Cavafy's poetry. I think particularly, this brings me on to my next element of the presentation, which is that obviously we are experiencing Cavafy's poetry in translation. It's been translated into English. It was originally written in Greek for the large part. The Greek language, in the way that it is communicated and written, has very different sort of experiences of rhyme and meter and so on within it than English does. And then the translation kind of, in many ways, robs us of that experience in so many ways. And many of the translations that exist of Cavafy have tried to kind of get a handle on how to communicate the very poetic aspects of his work, which are presented in meter and rhythm and rhyme and so on, which just don't translate fully into English, and how to kind of capture that. And some translators end up falling back on conventions of poetry in order to make up for that deficit, whereas other translators like the Mendelssohn are much more sort of literal or static in taking the words of the poem rather than the letter rather than the spirit. Sorry. I've put the two translations that I have/use on the screen. I am a big fan of the Keeley and Sherrard version, which is this one, which has the rather wonderful Hotney drawing of Cavafy on the front. I personally think this translation captures the spirit much closer, even if it does not necessarily apply utterly the letter of the translation. And many have felt that this translation, which is from, I believe, 1990s, so late 1980s, is a much more sort of accurate translation of the experience of reading Cavafy. Whereas the Mendelssohn, which I also have here, but it's a much bigger and heavier book, the Mendelssohn is a much more literal is a much more kind of specific and letter rather than spirit translation, and that is sort of interesting. And if you're considering sort of exploring some of this after this presentation, I would definitely recommend the contextual information and the introductory essays in the Mendelssohn. But I think in terms of the experience of reading the poems, I would say the Keeley and Sherrard is much more kind of full-bodied and much more of an experience, I think, of his work. There's a fantastic quote I've put up there from Asserman, who wrote a brilliant article on the experience of translating Cavafy, and he says this is the paradox that all translators must face: when to overstep the letter to preserve the spirit, and when to mistranslate in order to produce a poem that is worthy of the name. And I think that's what these two translations in particular that I've picked out kind of grapple with. Is it worth compromising on the specifics of the language that he has chosen in the Greek in order to produce the same effect and the same sort of poetic beauty in the English, or do you take a Mendelssohn approach, which is much more sort of literal and specific? So something to think about as we go on. I should say now, it's worth noting that the Cavafy, all of the poems that I've chosen for this presentation are from the Kilian Sherard, because it's the translation I prefer. But if there are any moments that I think of that it's relevant to bring in the Mendelssohn, I will. So just worth noting there. So I've talked very fast. I will take a breather now. Here is a somewhat legless spider diagram of what I consider to be some of the key themes in Cavafy's poetry. Now, obviously, I would not do him the injustice of suggesting that I have captured everything there is to say about the themes of Cavafy's poetry in this rather poor presentation slide. But what I have done is pick out some of the key sort of themes and then attach some sort of additional ideas to them. So the things that I'm going to look at for the rest of the presentation are the classical world and the ideas around eroticism, and the erotic nature of some of Cavafy's poetry and the ways in which those two sort of interlink. But I'm also going to bring in some of the other ideas that you can see on the left-hand side. So ideas around theatre, meta-theatre, meta-textuality, and bring in some ideas of tragedy, which I realise now is on there twice for some strange reason. How bizarre. Anyway, and I'm also going to think a little bit about interiority and exteriority. Now, obviously, a huge part of that comes from the kind of closeted, suppressed nature of Cavafy's poetry and his exploration of sex and sensuality. A huge part of that comes from this idea of the suppression of the self and the identity that he kind of tries to explore in some of his more erotic poems. But also from the idea of the physical and the metaphysical, the self and the inner, the self and the other, and so on, which are all really important in many of the poems that I'm going to talk about. And finally, the other thing that I think is really important, the echo's back. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so yeah, and the other final sort of theme, which I think is significant, is the theme of time, which comes up a lot in his poems, both in terms of sort of physical and personal experience of time, aging, loss, youth, decline, and in a sort of physical sense, but also in terms of the way that he explores the historical context within which he is both writing and setting his poems. So the ideas around empire and transition and movement, all of which were very significant in terms of the fact that he's writing about a classical world which no longer exists in the form that and the grandeur that it once did, but also is kind of in remnants around him. Both Alexandria and Greece are filled with these kind of remnants. He visits Athens often in order to explore that. So I think those are all important aspects. But the key ones that I'm going to talk about are the classical world and the erotic elements of his poetry and the ways in which those are potentially kind of combined or linked. So I'm going to talk about this with a rather sloppy sort of Venn diagram metaphor, in that I feel that it's often easy to sort of take the dichotomy and not to kind of challenge that too critically when you're initially reading the poems. And I think the best way to kind of counter that is to bring together all of the elements of cohesion in his poetry, the moments of which the universality of the human experience transcends the kind of historical boundaries of the kind of timeline of his work. There's a fantastic quotation from the Poetry Foundation introduction to his work. Cavafy's erotic poems and historical verse, so the two sides of the dichotomy, are products of a singular vision, one which explores in various ways the gratifications and ramifications of the pursuit of pleasure. And what I like about that quote is the idea of the singular vision. This is the same man, the same experience, producing both sides, if you like, of this experience. And the best way to kind of explore that is both the poems in which those two things present together and the ways in which those poems, which don't have both in them, can be brought together to reveal how much crossover there truly is. So that's kind of one of the things that I'm going to talk about. But the way I want to approach this verse is by exploring both the classical world and some of his erotic poems side by side, individually, and then together to explore in more detail. So I'll start with the ideas of Cavafy in the classical world, which are definitely the sort of titular elements of this presentation. So Cavafy's relationship with the classical world in his poems is both romantic, small r, and I think capital R to some extent, as well as being critical. The poem, one of his most famous poems, "Waiting for Barbarians," which I'm going to read to you in a little moment, because I think it's quite a good example of his work, both evokes Shelley's Ozymandias, and performs a acerbic criticism of sort of socio-political experience of the modern day at the same time. So the kind of two sides of that poem are both sort of revelatory in their own ways. Meanwhile, another of his poems, King Demetrius, which is one of my favorites, is only short. It reveals the performance of sovereignty in the collapse of a monarchy, the collapse of an empire, and is a reference to a Plutarch story of the same name. So that's a really interesting element of his sort of relationship with the classical world, which I think is important to bring in. And the other thing I think it's important to think about as well is the ways in which classical allusion and metaphor on a grand scale, rather than individual metaphor, the ways in which he actually uses the classical world itself as a whole as a metaphor for his modern day-to-day experience is really important. There's a fantastic article by Gonda van Steen, which explores the idea of theatre in Cavafy, which I'm going to come back to in a later slide. But I just wanted to include this quote here because I think it's really useful. She describes that many of his poems unmask with perspicacity and with daring the true nature of public and political life, and equate it with a life of play acting, with keeping up pretenses and with living up to artificial norms of expected decorum. And I think that's a really useful way to think about the ways in which Cavafy uses the kind of images and verisimilitudes, if you like, of the classical period, whilst also, you know, as I said, being quite a hefty criticism of modern sort of socio-political, the modern socio-political landscape. So, without further ado, here is Waiting for the Barbarians, which I will read because it is a fantastic poem, and I think it sounds so good out loud. The repeated interrogative sentences really kind of bring to the fore the meaning of the poem that he is exploring. So, yes, here we go. What are we waiting for? Assembled in the forum. The barbarians are due here today. Why isn't anything going on in the Senate? Why are the senators sitting there without legislating? Because the barbarians are coming today. What's the point of senators making laws now? Once the barbarians are here, they'll do the legislating. Why did our emperor get up so early, and why is he sitting enthroned at the city's main gate, in state, wearing the crown? Because the barbarians are coming today, and the emperor is waiting to receive their leader. He's even got a scroll to give him, loaded with titles, with imposing names. Why have our two consuls and praetors come out today, wearing their embroidered, their scarlet togas? Why have they put on bracelets with so many amethysts, rings sparkling with magnificent emeralds? Why are they carrying elegant canes beautifully worked in silver and gold? Because the barbarians are coming today, and things like that dazzle the barbarians. Why don't our distinguished orators turn up as usual to make their speeches and say what they have to say? Because the barbarians are coming today, and they're bored by rhetoric and public speaking. Why this sudden bewilderment, this confusion? How serious people's faces have become? Why are the streets and squares emptying so rapidly, everyone going home lost in thought? Because night has fallen, and the barbarians haven't come. And some of our men just in from the border say there are no barbarians any longer. Now what's going to happen to us without barbarians? Those people were kind of a solution. So this poem is fantastic for a number of reasons. One, because I think it's a really fantastic insight into what I've been talking about the prosaic nature of his poetry, which is by its very nature, is poetic, but is presented in a very sort of fantastically prosaic way. The questions here are of varying lengths, but yet the meter is continuous and consistent. Which you can tell from the very sort of rhythmic quality of reading. This is a fantastic one to read aloud, to really get familiar with the way that Cavafy writes. I also want to say that the language here, I think this is a really good example of the language that he uses, because there are some elements of this which are very sort of rich. Embroidered, I think, is a great metaphor here, wearing their embroidered, their scarlet togas. That whole stanza is filled with that really wonderful sort of vivid sort of imagery of riches and wonder, which I think draws on Cavafy's perhaps experience of sort of material wealth when he was younger. But then other elements of the passage are very much bare of that and are very sort of repetitive. The repetition of the barbarians over and over again, they sort of haunt this poem in much the same way that I think the Goths haunt Titus Andronicus, the Shakespeare play, which Cavafy would have been very familiar with. He was a big student of Shakespeare and of Oscar Wilde while he was living in England as a young man. So I think much of that is kind of revealed here. I think an essay that compared Titus Andronicus and this poem would be fascinating in terms of its exploration of the kind of social consequences of the clash of the self and the other. There's a fantastic quote I just want to add as well from J.L. Williams's essay on Waiting for the Barbarians on the Scottish Poetry Society. It says, similarly, the barbarians, the statesmen, and the general public in Waiting for the Barbarians are every society, and the poem has a resonance beyond its historical context. It speaks of how society is so often dependent on that which it excludes. As a homosexual, a fallen aristocrat, a man of various homelands, and a poet, Cavafy was well placed to comment on this subject, one as relevant today as it was in Cavafy's time and at the dawn of civilization. And I think that's a fantastic quote. It obviously does rather sort of state the obvious, but at the same time, I think really sort of makes explicit how significant Cavafy's experience was in then creating and delivering sort of socio-political messages like these in his more sort of classically attuned works. So yeah, this is one of my favourite poems by him. I think it's fantastic. The lyrical kind of lilt to it is wonderful, makes for a wonderful reading experience. Yeah, okay. So the next thing I want to sort of think about is the ways in which some of his other classical poems, so here I've got the Horses of Achilles, compared with a poem called An Old Man, which is set very much in the modern day, the present day, in which he's writing, whereas the Horses of Achilles is obviously a classical reference. It's a reference to the death of Patroclus, and which is witnessed by the Horses of Achilles, by whom they're owned, and Zeus looks down upon the tragedy that has just occurred and feels sorry for the horses, for their experience of the kind of fleeting, transient nature of human life compared to something that is immortal. And he describes it as, better we hadn't given you as a gift unhappy horses. What business did you have down there among pathetic human beings, the toys of fate? You're free of death, you won't get old, yet ephemeral disasters torment you. And I think it's a fantastic exploration of the way in which the sort of tragic and the classical are brought into close contact with the reality and the ephemerality even of human life. And I think contrasted to that is a poem that's written the same year, which is actually presented side by side in the Achillean Sherard, which is a poem called An Old Man, which is simply a description of an old man reading a newspaper in a cafe, who has a kind of moment of, I suppose you could call it a moment of recognition, very much in the classical sense. He remembers impulses bridled, the joy he has sacrificed, every chance he lost now mocks his brainless prudence. So he has a kind of moment of recognition of his age and of what he's missed and of the inevitability of what comes next, which is kind of grappled with, I think, in the Horses of Achilles by negation. By thinking about the idea of immortality and the fact that of being free of death, one is given a whole different set of issues to contend with, whereas we humans have to deal with mortality in lots of different ways. The final sort of stanza, so much thinking, so much remembering makes the old man dizzy, I think is a really interesting expression of that physicality that I mentioned in the theme section, and is one that kind of returns often in both the classical and erotic aspects of Cavafy's work. He talks often in the erotic poems of the physical experience, but also I think the physical experience of time here is really relevant in a kind of natural tragedy, I suppose. The tragedy of realizing that time passes and there is nothing we can do about that, in the same way that the death of Patroclus is a kind of inevitability that Zeus kind of wills upon the horses. So yeah, I think they form quite an interesting kind of contrast potentially in terms of the ways in which those aspects are compared. And finally, on the sort of flip side of that is the idea of the pleasurable aspects and the ways in which poems that Cavafy writes often contend with the classical world at the same time as embodying some of those very sort of erotic aspects of his present day poems, in inverted commas. So you've got another section from several sections from several poems. There's a fantastic poem called The Funeral of Sarpedon, which explores the death of the son of a classical monarch, and the body is prepared for burial, and it's described as he washes the dust away, he spreads and arranges the beautiful limbs, and the rest of the poem is a kind of beautification of the dead body and almost an eroticization of the tragedy and of the death of this young man and the capturing of youth in death, which I think haunts so many sort of tragic pieces. And this is a really sort of fantastic exploration of that. And finally, I think the poem that does both of these themes, both of these sort of halves I've been trying to reunite throughout this presentation so greatly, I think the poem that does that in the most effective way possible is one of his later poems, Caesarion, which I love. I love this poem. I think it's fantastic. He describes Cavafy as the speaker describes an experience of reading a book of inscriptions, classical inscriptions on graves, and about the Ptolemies, the family of the Egyptian pharaoh families, the Ptolemies. And he's describing a description of he's describing reading a description of King Caesarion, and very little detail is given in the book that he's reading about Caesarion. And so he kind of imagines the young man himself and creates an image of him. And he describes it as feeling more free in his mind to make of this classical figure something that he at once is kind of satisfied with as a kind of description of a classical figure, but also satisfied with in a very erotic sense of bringing a young man back to life. He kind of injects a great quote from a critic which describes him as injecting life, the sublimity of life back into the dead. And I love the quotation. It seems you stood there in front of me looking just as you would have in conquered Alexandria, pale and weary, ideal in your grief. So he is a perfect physical specimen who is experiencing so much of this sort of enormity, the enormity of the tragedy of monarchy and of death and of grief and so on. And the Caesar's reference at the end, I think, is particularly potent. So that is sort of the ways in which these poems deal with those two halves, if you like. And the final thing I want to talk about is Cavafy and theatre, and the ways in which perhaps we could bring this around to the tragedy paper for any English students listening. Van Steen, in her article about Cavafy and theatre, describes Cavafy's poetry writing as deeply embedded in the hermeneutics of dramatization, of strategizing on stage and also off stage. And he does this in a number of ways, one of which is describing many sort of political and social aspects of monarchy, rulership, and so on, as if they are a drama sort of being set out, the drama of monarchy, which I think much of English literature kind of contends with as having a kind of experience of monarchy which is still present. Whereas Cavafy's poetry is kind of indebted to a classical set of rulers, emperors, monarchs, kings, and so on in that sense. It's also his poetry also is kind of indebted to a tradition of Greek stage drama as well, and much of that is revealed through a reading of his poetry, both in sense of the tragic aspects of his narratives, but also in terms of the explorations of the divine versus the human, and some of the Aristotelian kind of aspects of the poetic. So the idea of valuing plot over character rather than fleshing out character in too much depth. He tends to focus more on the aspects of the story and of the setting. And leave it more general, in which kind of supports a reading of his poems as being sort of transportative from the classical world to the now and back again. So I've put a couple of examples of poems which I think sort of do this quite well, are quite neat sort of representations of this. So in the left-hand side, I've put the poem King Demetrios, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation. I've just put the final stanza of that, which is, he took off his golden robes, threw away his purple buskins, and quickly dressing himself in simple clothes, he slipped out, just like an actor who, the play over, changes his costume and goes away. So he's very explicit often, and the prosaic nature of his work makes it very kind of clear that is the distinction he's drawing, that he is suggesting these very clear kind of messages about monarchy and the performance of it. But also I think there are other aspects of his poetry which are more veiled and are potentially more kind of specific in terms of the ways in which he explores theatre. So there's a fantastic poem called At the Theatre, which is written the same year, in which he describes the experience of spotting somebody he finds attractive in the audience. I got bored looking at the stage and raised my eyes to the box circle. And I think this is both possibly an anecdote from life, but also very much a kind of commentary on his experience of the drama of everyday life, and the prosaic nature of his work really kind of captures, I think, the necessity of the drama and spectacle of everyday life, and of his experience of eroticism and of erotic encounters with young men, and the ways in which those kind of tie into his more sort of scholarly understanding of these experiences. And finally, I think the Alexandrian Kings, which is another, perhaps the most famous of his poems, along with Waiting for the Barbarians and Caesarion. The Alexandrians knew, of course, this was all words, all theatre. They just watched a coronation, and yet they know what empty words these really were, these kingships. And I think that idea of the empty words, the emptying of the significance, I think is a really important aspect of the way in which Cavafy explores classical imagery, classical verisimilitude, because what he's doing is kind of revealing, in hollowing out these ideas, in hollowing out these presentations of monarchy, of rulership, of sovereignty. He's really sort of creating a generalization that he can then bring into the fore and bring into the kind of cohesive vision of the world through his poetry. I've included another quote from the Van Steen just in the right-hand corner, which is specifically relevant to the Alexandrian Kings poem. She describes it as a deadpan drama which could not be further removed from a contemporary theatre that pursued stardom or publicity. And I think that's one of the really interesting aspects of Cavafy's poetry, is that his experience of theatre and his presentation of theatre is very much a classical theatre, and is indebted to that in ways that make it only sort of permissible or transmissible through those aspects of classical drama, not in terms of contemporary understandings of theatre, which would have been set around at the time he was writing. Yeah, so finally, I just wanted to sort of think about potentially some ways in which this could be sort of brought towards the tragedy paper, both in terms of exploring more about that theatre aspect that I've kind of explained as I've been going, but also in terms of the way in which the tragedy paper functions. I had an interesting conversation with my DOS the other day about the ways in which the tragedy paper could be approached, and one of the things that he sort of outlined is the idea of the conceptualization of tragedy, having a kind of personal theory or mode of tragedy that you then want to kind of bring to every essay that you write, or bring to the exam, and kind of explore any of the material that you're given in terms of a personal kind of encapsulation of that experience. Or the other way to go is a kind of wider frame of reference in which you explore tragedy according to lots of different definitions. And I think Cavafy potentially it could be a useful part of either approach, and either in terms of forming quite a useful kind of lens, I think, for my personal encapsulation of tragedy, in terms of exploring the sort of theatre and tragic aspects, more conventional tragic aspects of the classical tragedies that we have to talk about, but also forming quite an updated and useful kind of set of reference points for modern Greek poetry and poetry in translation from the period. So yeah, I also think that, as I touched on some aspects of the meta-theatrics or meta-poetics, the way in which he comments on his own experience of theatre and poetry are really important. And finally, I think potentially some kind of, as I've been pointing out as I go along, some way of comparing and contrasting some of Cavafy's poetry to Greek tragedies, and I think potentially also Shakespearean tragedies could be a really interesting way of exploring both sets of text, and also potentially modern iterations of Greek tragedy sort of put alongside it. I can think of several sort of versions of retranslations or rewritings of Greek tragedies that would fit well, I think, with a comparison to Cavafy's sort of more tragic aspects or more tragic works. The final thing I want to talk about, and I will then proceed to try and find a wrap-up point here, because I've been talking for quite a long time. But the final point I wanted to bring up is the way in which Cavafy sort of translates into other arts and other forms. This is actually the first poem I ever saw of Cavafy's. It was on a podcast for The History of a World in 100 Objects by Neil MacGregor, which you can now buy a book of, as well as downloading the podcast for free. I would highly recommend it. It is fantastic. But also in it, one of his 100 objects is this picture that you can see on the right-hand side in Dull Village, which is a Hockney etching from 1966. And the etching, as you can see, of two men lying in bed, was released the year that homosexuality was legalized in the UK. He quite literally could not have released it any earlier. It would have been illegal. And so he describes the way in which this poem was inspired by a poem by Cavafy called In the Boring Village, which I have put on the left-hand side. It's a fantastic poem. I think it's really beautiful. It's one of my favorites by him. I think it really captures the sense of the experience of closetedness and suppression, and the experience of wanting to be to access sensuality in the ways that most make sense, and to kind of, I think, yeah, I think it really speaks to those aspects of the experience of queerness, which are really important. I love the story of how Hockney came across this poem. He actually found it, he talks in the podcast, they interview him, he talks of finding the poem on the back of a library book about something else, and taking it out and borrowing it and then bringing it back to look for a book of just Cavafy poems. He wants to find more of them, only to discover that those poems were actually restricted. They were in the restricted section of the library because of their content. And so he steals the original book that has the Cavafy poem on the back in order to have a copy of it, and he never takes it back. So yeah, I think that it really kind of speaks to the significance of Cavafy's poetry in sort of revelations, experiences, and historical kind of progressions of public attitudes and experiences of LGBTQ issues and queerness and so on, which is really significant, I think, in this modern day, and potentially is why drawing some of these ideas and poems and texts into a reading of the tragedy paper could be so fruitful and so interesting. I think that is everything. So I will wrap up there. Thank you for listening, which I would absolutely like to say I really appreciate anybody coming along to listen today. I have some recommended reading, so if anybody would like a copy of this presentation or of this slide in particular, do feel free to get in touch with me. I've put my contact details here if you would like my email address or to contact me on social media. Do let me know if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint, and I would also love to know what anybody thought of what I've said today. I have really enjoyed giving this presentation, and it's been a really fantastic opportunity. So if you would like to DM me or email me and let me know what you thought, that would be fantastic. I would love some feedback. And that is about it. So I will wrap up there. I should have left enough time to answer some questions or have a bit of discussion if there is anything that anybody wants to bring up. So yeah. Oh, thank you. That's very nice. Let's just put in the chat. I'm really glad that you thought it was insightful. Okay. Do you think there can be a clear distinction between different types of poem, historical, erotic, mortality, or are they all in a single vision? I think, as I said, I like the fact that you picked out the words from the quote. I think absolutely this idea of the singular vision is really important, because I think otherwise it's overly easy to dichotomize and kind of cut out, I think, the aspects of Cavafy's view on the world, which are so important to creating that singular vision. I think it would be too easy to kind of exercise almost the really significant aspects of the way in which his view on these issues is different to so many other poets who have written about them before or since. So yeah, to me, I think they all form a cohesive picture, and I think the more of Cavafy that you read, the more you realize how cohesive that picture truly is. But I think many readers on first glance are a bit too quick to put his poems into boxes and go, this one's about this and this one's about this, and not recognize the extent to which they are all influenced by the same experiences and ideas, and also how important it is for him to communicate his experience of eroticism through presentations of the classical world and through presentations of the theatre and so on. So those are all, I think, really, really important ideas. So yes, thank you for the question. Are there any other questions? I'm happy to take questions out loud as well as by chat.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so interesting. I really loved hearing about it. And yeah, it was really interesting to hear his like different kind of depictions of youth and this kind of like glamorization of youth. And I know you were saying that kind of when he was 40 was quite like a significant time for him. I was just wondering, like, kind of if you could speak a little bit more about his kind of own experience of aging, if you knew anything.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no. From what I know of Cavafy, I know he had some quite significant health issues throughout his life. He had a very close friend who he named as the heir to his estate some 10 years before he actually dies. So he has some quite significant health issues throughout his life. I think mortality is something that haunts both his work and his experience of life. And I think there is a quality of hedonism, which I think he got from his appreciation of Oscar Wilde to some degree, to the way that he sort of lives and works. Was known to keep a room at a brothel in Alexandria, which he visited regularly, and he had lots of experiences, sort of beautiful youths he met in cafes. There's a wonderful poem that he writes of going into a fabric shop or an accessories sort of boutique, if you like, and having a conversation with the cashier, who is a young man, and the sort of tension of eroticism that he experiences in this kind of public sphere in sort of dangerous ways, which I think is quite interesting and speaks to, I think, his experience of the kind of fleeting, ephemeral nature of living and of human life, which I think kind of preoccupies much of his writing about aging and the experience of that. There are many poems titled An Old Man or similar in his work as well. I think he's written long before he is an old man as well. So I think it's something that he's kind of has lots of forethought about. And yeah, there is some kind of documented sort of elements of both his style and form, and also his kind of writing, that change significantly once he passes the age of 40 and has to start kind of reckoning with some of those sort of predominant health issues that he experiences. So that's interesting as well in terms of a biographical kind of reflection of sort of textual qualities of many of his pieces. So yeah, I think absolutely, I think an exploration. I think that's why so many of the writers that have written on Cavafy, like the Mendelssohn in his introductory essay, take a very kind of chronological timeline rather than being too lateral, because so much of his work kind of explores that on both a personal and historical sort of stage. So yeah, I think absolutely there's a lot to be explored there.